Hey guys, in this video we're going to be sheeting a wall on the ground. We're hoping to show you everything you need to know in order to do this in your own house. So the very first thing you're going to do is get your bottom plate on your chalk line where it needs to go left and right. So we'll tap that around with a sledge. So this wall is butting into this wall here. So first thing we need to do is get it tight to this plate. Second thing is that you can see our chalk line right in here, and we want the bottom of our plate on the chalk line looking down it. So we're going to bump it around and bump it over. So we got our line coming out here, and we want that to be 5.5. So we're going to make a line on our bottom plate so that we can see that. And hopefully when we bump in tight to that other wall, we should land right on this chalk line here. So right here, you can see we're tight to this plate, and now we want to get it flush on this chalk line. So you can see as I tap it over, we want it to split the line just like that. Since we're splitting this line, we're going to nail it on the line. Now this is a tricky shot, but you toenail it through the bottom plate, and you try and get the toenail to hit right on this line. Sometimes it's on this side of it, and that's okay, but do your best. Makes the next part easier. Oof. You don't really want this to happen, but that's okay. If it does, the wall will bend right over it. Okay, so we'll work down this line, nailing it about every 4 feet or so, and I'm gonna keep adjusting it with the sledge so that we're splitting that line in half. Okay, so we got our wall nailed to that chalk line, so we know it's straight. Next, we're gonna go ahead and put our shear blocks in. We're gonna shear block all the seams on this house. So in order to do that, we gotta figure out where our sheet is gonna land. And in this case, we want it to hang over the wall and wrap down this ladder truss so that it ties in the wall. And then we'll rip a strip for up top and finish off the sheeting up top. So on this house, we're flushing our sheeting with the bottom of the sill plate here. So we have 22.25 right here, and we'll check in a couple places. 22.25, 22.25 about, and 22.25. Now we're gonna hang our tape off the bottom of our wall, 22.25, and then holding it there, we're gonna come up here, make a mark at 96. That's our sheet length. We're gonna be using 2x4s on the side to block this. Since they're just shear blocks and not fire blocks, it does not have to be a 2x6 perpendicular to the studs this way. Because this wall is less than 10 feet tall, we don't have to fire block it. So we're just gonna put a 2x4 on its side. So to split a 2x4 on this, we'll come down 1.75 inches here, make a mark, and this is where we nail our block, and this is where we chalk our sheeting line. So we'll do that on the other side as well, and we'll chalk our line. So now we're going to cut our shear blocks for this wall. And since our chalk line and our blocks are closer to the top than the bottom, when we cut our blocks, we're going to cut them based on how the studs are spaced at the top of the wall. Here we are up top. So we're going to line our board up here. We're going to look down the end and flush it up with the inside of this stud. We're not going to block this cavity because it's less than 6 inches. And since our nailing pattern is 6 inches on center at the edges, we don't have to block this. Please comment down below if I'm wrong on that. We got our board flushed up. Now I'm going to put my saw in. I have the blade touching the stud. I'm looking at this line here, and I'm going to trace this stud right here, looking down it squarely. That cuts our block to length. It fits in really well without holding a tape measure. And since we did it up here, even though right here this stud might be bowed, we know that it's the right measurement when we nail it tight. So we'll put that block down and we'll move on. The other way of cutting blocks is to use a jig, or if you have a worm drive with 1.5 inches between this edge and the saw blade, you can flush it up on the outside and drop it in here. But this method goes really quick. We'll show you on this run. So now we're going to install our blocks walking forward. Now before we chalk our line for sheeting, we're just going to make sure this wall is perfectly square so we can sheet it and stand it and it's plumb. So we'll hook the tape on this corner down here. We'll pull diagonals. Tyler's going to measure this far side here. So we pulled diagonals, and when you pull diagonals, you want to make sure to hook directly on the corner. And when you're reading the tape on the other end, you want to make sure and look straight down that corner. And if our diagonals are the same measurement, that means our wall is square. In this case, we're square because we're bumped into this wall here, which is square when we chalk the house. So we're within a 30 seconds, so we're going to chalk and sheet this. Okay, so we got our wall sheeted here. We'll just give a couple review tips on what we did. So we sheeted this bottom section first, and right here on this seam is where our chalk line was on our blocks. And we flushed up this line here, and that gave us the proper overhang on the other side, so that when we stand this wall up, it will go down and tie into the ladder truss. Another thing is that we hung these sheets long because they're going to go up and tie in the truss heels. So we looked at the truss specs and we saw how tall these heels were here, and we left it down below the tail so that when we set these trusses, we just butt them tight to the sheeting here. That is only possible if your sill plate is done perfectly, because your walls will plumb up and be the dimensions of the roof truss. If you're worried about your house being a little bit off, do not do this. It will make setting roof trusses very difficult. Same thing down here. We chalked a line at the bottom plate so that when we're nailing here, we can nail into the bottom plate and not underneath the plate, because that nail would be underneath the wall when we stand it up. Last thing is, over here, you can see we didn't sheet this. When we pull our layout for that garage wall down there and we sheet it, it will tie these walls together because the sheet overlaps this wall, and the garage wall. Now, just a few other tips if you're sheeting on the ground. For example, this wall here, if this was the corner of our house, we would leave these last sheets off, kind of like we did this one, and we'd also leave that top off, so that after we stand it, we can come back and just sheet up that corner to tie it in. So don't worry about your sheets hitting, just leave them off and put them on after you stand the wall. When we Tyvek it, we'll fold it back here so that we can wrap it around the wall later. Also, if you're ever sheeting walls on the ground on a slab, it can be very difficult to get the bottom straight on a chalk line. You may have to clamp it away from or towards the bolts. Sometimes we've even used a Tyvekking board to hold our wall in place straight. But a common thing that you run into on slabs is that there's pipes sticking up. So wherever there's a pipe up, you just leave that sheet off, put it on after you stand it. So now we're ready to Tyvek this, and we'll show you guys how we do that. So for Tyvekking, we have a whacker tacker and our machine gun stapler by Spot Nails. This has a safety feature right here, so that when you fire it, it just shoots. We use this to go quicker on Tyvek. So when we're Tyvekking here and we're standing walls sheeted, we want to do the highest part first. We'll come back after we stand the wall and Tyvek this lower part, because we have to nail in the sheeting to the ladder truss. So we'll raise it up here. We'll fold this part down after we get it rolled out, because then we'll nail this part into our truss heels to hold that in. Line up our line here. We'll flush it on this seam Then when we stand the wall perpendicular to this wall, we'll fold the Tyvek in so we can wrap it around this corner and staple it off. We lined it up on the top there, so now we can pull it tight. I'm not going to staple this section so that we can fold this up, Tyvek under here after the wall is stood, and then fold it back down so that the water runs continuously down the wall. As you can see, when you sheet your walls on the ground and you Tyvek on the ground, you can get the Tyvek really nice and straight so it doesn't have any wrinkles. Makes it easier for siding. Up top here, don't staple within about 6 inches of the top of the window, because we're going to cut this back and fold it up so when we install the window we can fold it back down over top. So right here I'm just going to cut it off straight line so that when we Tyvek this wall we'll just run it long and overlap it. So we left the top and the bottom unstapled so that we can flap them up, nail it, flap them down, bottom over the Tyvek. But I'm just going to go through and put staple every 3 feet or so. We can pull these out easily so that the wind doesn't catch this and rip it off before we get there. A little trick is when you're nailing an edge that you don't want to blow off is to put the staple parallel with the edge of the Tyvek. It's 10 times harder for the wind to rip off than if the staple was perpendicular to the edge. You want this one, not this, because this is way harder for the wind to rip off. You can see that it holds versus coming out. There you go. So we're going to go ahead and Tyvek our other run, our other wall that we sheeted, and then we're going to stand them both up and we'll show you guys how we do that. Okay, this wall was brutal to Tyvek. Tyler! Can you help? Can you pull that up? You gotta staple it down. Can you staple it? But we're gonna go ahead and stand it up and pivot it on those toenails. So here we go, let's see how this goes. So we're getting ready to stand this wall here. And to strap it up, we pulled center of the wall to kind of get a center of weight. And then we pulled, I think on this we did 6 feet on each side. That'll give us a lot of room, a lot of height with our strap. We'll see how that goes. We got our brackets here. We'll show you these as we stand it up, but they loop around the top plate and grab it from the underside. And the reason that works is because the sheeting is nailed into the top plate all the way across here. So that's what will carry the weight of this wall. Now, as we stand this, it's very tricky to stand it so that you're keeping tension on the wall, but not pulling out those toenails. So if it does pull out those toenails, it gets a lot trickier, and we'll see how this goes. So we got our wall stood, and the first thing we do, if we need, we can throw a brace on it, but you can't brace it plumb until the bottom is nailed on the chalk line. So without this wall falling over, our first priority is to look down that chalk line and get it split right on that chalk line. Then we're gonna nail, and since we're on a ladder truss, we have 3.5 inches on the outside of this plate to nail the whole way. So right here, we're off the line. We're outset over the house. And sometimes it can be really tricky to get it back on the line because our sheeting goes down over the ladder truss. So if your line's a little bit bigger than 5.5, it can be impossible to get it back unless you have one of these. And you just take it, pound it into your plate, subfloor. Now watch as it pulls it back with the lever. When you're flushing on your chalk line, the most important part is next to these intersections from the interior walls, because these plates are already cut to length. So if we're outset or inset, it's gonna mess up these walls on the other end. So after you get it nailed down on your chalk line, we're good to plumb it. And there's a couple ways to brace these, but we use turnbuckles a lot of the time. Gives us room to adjust it if the wind blows it out of plumb. So we got our 3-dot laser here. We butt it into the plate, look up top, and we want that dot to be running up the side of the plate, because that's where it is down below. So we're gonna push it out until it runs right up the side there. You can see it running up the side of the plate. Now that we're close to plumb on this whole wall, we're gonna go on the outside and nail on the sheeting to the ladder truss. One more thing I need to mention about sheeting walls on ground. To sheet a wall on the ground, ideally you need a flat floor, because you're making the bottom plate flat before you sheet it when you line it up on that chalk line. So especially on concrete, if it's not flat, then it's very difficult, because your sheeting is going to hold your wall perfectly flat on the bottom, and if your floor goes like this, you're going to have gaps. And in this case we don't have gaps, but we did pull up our studs here on the end. So we have to make sure to get these gaps down before we nail the sheeting onto the ladder truss. We do not want these to settle when the roof weight goes on. So if your concrete or your floor, heaven forbid, is super wavy, you probably want to stand the wall unsheeted, knock it down so it's tight, and then sheet it. Or otherwise you're gonna have gaps underneath structural points, and that's just not good. Okay, so we're nailing off our ladder truss. And since we lined our stud layout up with this ladder, it's gonna be really easy, because we can just follow the nails down on these lines to hit our ladder. So we're gonna nail this off, same nailing pattern. If you nail the top of the ladder, ties it in very well so that this wall is basically concreted into this ladder truss. And we can do that because we have our line here for the bottom plate. Now when we're nailing into this bottom plate here, it's treated. It's a treated sill plate. So we're going to use galvanized nails for that bottom row all the way around the house. This is an inspected code requirement in our area, so we're very careful to do this. If your house ever gets hit by a tornado, those are the most important nails, because that sill plate is not leaving, but the house might. Okay, so there you have it. A sheeted wall on the ground, stood up, nailed off, tied in. Ideally, everything goes smooth. You get a square wall, everything stays the same, you pivot right up, nail it in. But real life is often a lot hairier. Not all the time, but it happens. One more thing about standing walls on concrete is you can't, when you sheet a wall on the ground on concrete, you can't toenail it down. So you're gonna be picking that wall up and usually setting it on bolts. Now a trick for that is to put your straps over both the forks, because then you're able to set in one side on a bolt, and as you tip the telehandler a little bit, you can work it down one bolt at a time. That makes it a lot easier. Second thing is, for really big walls, when we do a fire block, we'll do a double fire block. And that's because our sheeting splits on that. So when we bolt the walls down on the J-bolts, that double fire block allows us to split the sheeting and fully capture the bottom plate. And the reason you want your sheeting really nailed into that bottom plate is because if you're pounding it down to get rid of any gaps, or you're sucking it down with the bolts on the J-bolts, you don't want it to just suck that bottom plate right off your wall, because then your studs are gapped. You want to actually pull that whole wall down, and it's very hard because it's already sheared with the sheeting. Last trick, worst case scenario, you have a bit of a hump in your wall and you have a gap below your top plate. You want to pound that bottom plate all the way down, and you want to shim underneath the studs. This is worst case scenario. The reason you want to pound the bottom plate down, whether you're on concrete or floor trusses, is that you want that bottom plate to be carrying the load. You don't want shims underneath the bottom plate, you want it underneath the stud, so that the stud puts the load down to the bottom plate. So worst case scenario, you pound that bottom plate all the way down and shim underneath the studs and cut it off and make it look real nice. So that's all we have for sheeting a wall on the ground. Be sure to check out our other videos right here. And if you guys got any value out of this, please subscribe, because we're going to be doing a video about everything it takes to frame a house, every single skill.